What makes a great story? There's 5 things that make a great story. The first thing is great characters. There's got to be characters that you fall in love with, that you have sympathy for, that kind of grip your heart, that you have some sort of connection with. That's what makes a great story. Secondly, tragedy or adversity. There's some kind of tragedy that needs to be overcome. It could be racism. It could be a villain. It could be some sort of government oppression that needs to be overcome. Thirdly, there's tension in a great story. There's rising tension. It kind of causes this, this disequilibrium within you that needs to be resolved. And there's this rising tension in a story. Fourthly, there's heroes. There's a savior. There is someone who overcomes the adversity, who actually resolves the tension within you. And then lastly, there's lessons. There's things that we learn. There's some sort of consequences and outcomes that leave you feeling satisfied, or they leave you feeling like you've actually learnt something. If a story has those 5 things, it'll be a great story. Now, a story doesn't even have to be long to actually be great. Let me give you an example. This is a story that has 145 words, and it's a true story. Let me read it to you. Sue and John were married for 46 years. Each Valentine's Day, John would send Sue the most beautiful flowers containing a note with 5 simple words. My love for you grows. Last year, after 46 years of marriage, John passed away. On her first Valentine's Day alone, 10 months after John's death, Sue was shocked to receive a gorgeous bouquet addressed to her from John. Angry and heartbroken, Sue called the florist to say there's been an insensitive mistake. How could they have got it so wrong? And the florist replied, "No, ma'am, it's not a mistake. Before your husband passed away, he prepaid for many years to come so that you'd still get flowers on Valentine's Day every year." With her heart in her throat, Sue hung up the phone and read the attached card, and it said, "My love for you is eternal." Great story, huh? I mean, you love John. Don't you just love John? He is a great character. We feel the adversity with Sue because she's actually lost her soulmate. She's lost John in his death. And then we feel the rising tension where she gets the bouquet and there's this potential insensitive mistake that's been made by the florist, but John is the hero, even in death. And we all kind of get this lesson. We all feel warmed in our soul, some sort of lesson about enduring love and commitment. And maybe for some of the girls here thinking, where can I find a man like that? The Bible is, even though it's an historical record, it's written with a grand meta-narrative. It has a big story that runs through it all. There's characters, and there's tragedies, and there's adversity, and there's tension, and there's heroes, and there's lessons. And if we only look at the micro-narratives of the Bible, the individual stories, which are important because they do teach us many things, we can actually miss an extremely important big picture that entirely has something to do with Easter. In fact, that pivots all around Easter, that can actually has the potential to do something very powerful in us this Easter if we don't miss it. Well, Pilate and Jesus is one such micro account. It's a pivotal moment in the grand story of the Bible. And so in John 18:28, Pontius Pilate, you imagine this, he steps out on his courtyard to preside over a 33-year-old normal-looking Jewish man. And this man is brought to him, and he walks out of his courtyard and he looks at this man. And he has no idea of the real background to this trial. No idea. Yes, Pilate's heard the hallway chatter about a man who has caused a stir in the temple. And he has heard about these mysterious healings of a man who has been healing the blind and the sick, but that was just, from religious nutters. And of course, he'd heard about that weirdo, John the Baptist, who had come, but the thing is, he only knew about him because Herod chopped off his head because, he confronted Herod about his messy divorce. And so he knew some kind of rumors, some things about Jesus, but Pilate didn't know the true background to the trial. The story of the world before the trial, its characters, its tragedies, its tension, its heroes, its lessons. He unwittingly has this Jewish man come before him, but he has no idea what has transpired. The world before the trial. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God saw that everything in it was good. And the tragedy begins in the most unlikeliest of places. It begins in a garden where man and woman have perfect union with God, no strife. They have everything that they need. They walk with God daily. And yet sin enters the world through their disobedience. And right from Genesis 3:15, what you see emerge is two rival kingdoms. That God announces that there is going to be hostility between the seed of the woman, and there is going to be hostility between the seed of the serpent. And so God announces that there is going to be these rival kingdoms. The kingdom of the seed of the woman versus the kingdom of the seed of the serpent. But the promise that comes with this announcement is that the seed of the woman is going to prevail. This is the grand meta-narrative of the Bible. That the seed of the woman is going to prevail. But over and over and over again, if you read through the Old Testament, some of you read it and you go, what the heck is this talking about? What's the big story of it? Over and over again, we see in the Old Testament that the promise of the seed is threatened. Over and over again, it's threatened. Is it really going to prevail? And we see it in the very next story of the Bible, Cain and Abel. Cain murders his brother Abel in cold blood, but God preserves the seed, the line that he is going to bring forth the seed of the woman through his son Seth. But then we see centuries go past where the world descends into wickedness. But God preserves Noah and his family in the ark. And then that is supposed to be pushing the reset button, the restart button on the world. But then very quickly we see the cycle, the degenerative cycle again of sin enter the world until God makes good on his promise to a man named Abram. He says, Abram, look up to the stars. See how many stars there are. That is going to be the number of your descendants. But Abraham, in his own kind of human thinking, thinks, there's no way. You see, Sarah, my wife, and I are of age. And Sarah can't conceive. And so Abram tries to take it into his own hands, and he lays with his maidservant and has a child, an illegitimate child. But God says to Abram, I don't need your help. I'm the one who's preserving the seed, and so he provides a son through Sarah, Isaac. And Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob, who continue this rivalry. Esau, through strife and jealousy, wants to kill Jacob, but Jacob is the promised seed. He is the one that God has chosen to carry it forth. In the very next story, we see Joseph, who is mercilessly sold into slavery into this pagan nation of Egypt by his own brothers. But God is preserving Joseph, and he actually allows him to rise up into the highest ranks of Egyptian authority. He has a bond with Pharaoh, the ruler of the time. But then at the very start of Exodus, we see that Pharaoh did not know Joseph after he passed away. And so the Israelites, they fall under Egyptian slavery. And then all of a sudden, God provides another deliverer, Moses, even though Pharaoh has tried to snuff out all the children by killing the babies, by drowning the babies. But God preserves Moses' life, and he grows up in a palace, and he is the one who will become the deliverer of Israel, who will take them across the Red Sea, and finds himself at the top of a mountain receiving a covenant from God, that if the people of Israel obey, they will experience the blessings of the covenant. They will go into the promised land that God has for them. But if they disobey, then they will experience the covenant curses. Well, Joshua is the one. Moses, through his unfaithfulness, doesn't get to see the promised land, but Joshua is the one who carries it forward. But over time, you see that Israel rejects God's kingship over the earth. And they want a king like all the other nations have a king. We want an earthly king, and so they get out ahead of God and they appoint Saul. And that turns out to be a disaster. You see, God's chosen one was actually David. He is the one who the seed would come through. And so David is a faithful king, and perhaps the seed of David will be the one who delivers the world, but the seed of David turns out to be Solomon, who starts out as a faithful king, but turns out like all the rest of them proved to be. All the kings after David who are supposed to occupy, be God's representative on earth to mediate the covenant between the people of Israel and God, all turn out to be unfaithful. And there's this cycle of degeneration throughout the Old Testament of wicked kings until what you see happen is the nation of Israel, this united nation, gets divided into north and south. They're a divided kingdom. And in the end, they end up in exile. So they are actually carried away from their land by pagan nations. Now, God in his mercy, after 70 years, he brings them back to their land. This is the story of the Old Testament. He brings them back to their land. He gives them the grace to be able to rebuild the temple and to rebuild the walls. But the question still lingers, who's going to occupy the throne? Where's the promised seed who's going to occupy the throne and bring about God's kingdom on earth? Has the kingdom of the serpent prevailed? This is the grand narrative of the Bible. And then what you see happen as you open the pages of the New Testament, the second half of the book, you see in a little town of Bethlehem, there's a seed of a woman. There's a seed of Mary. And the serpent rears his ugly head because he motivates Herod to kill a whole generation of boys, that this Messiah may not come and fulfill what he's been called to do. But Jesus is preserved. And everything points to Jesus as the fulfillment of the promise. This is the one. And Jesus goes into the desert. He's led into the desert by the Holy Spirit, and he is tempted to give away who he really is, but he passes the test. And then John the Baptist comes and says, "Prepare the way of the Lord." And then he baptized Jesus, and there's a voice from heaven that says, "This is my son with whom I am well pleased." And his ministry begins. He comes to do what he was called to do in the earth, but then the unthinkable happens. His own people reject him. The ones that he came to save reject him. And as we've seen from John 5 onwards, the religious leaders have a plot to kill Jesus. And this is something which keeps this rivalry very clear through the New Testament. It's a very clear statement that Jesus makes to these religious leaders who represent the kingdom of the serpent. In John 8:44, Jesus says to them, "You belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native tongue, for he is a liar and the father of lies." You see, there is an ongoing face-off here. The kingdom of the seed of the serpent versus the kingdom of the seed of the woman. Satan is the one who we see earlier in John, who comes in and he deceives Judas to go and hand Jesus over to the Jews for just 30 pieces of silver, who then hand him on to the Roman authorities, which is why Jesus is standing right before Pilate in this scene. This is the background to the trial. This is the real background to the trial. And Pilate sees this normal 33-year-old Jewish man walking up to him, bound in chains, and he has no idea of the real background to the trial, of where this man has really come from. Pilate, he must have presided over hundreds of trials. In fact, 10 years after this, would he even have remembered about this one? Would he even have known, been able to bring to mind? Was it that significant to him? But the reality of it is that the kingdoms have come face to face with one another once again. Pilate, as the representative of the kingdom of the seed of the serpent, and Jesus, the seed of the woman. The seed of the serpent carries all the might of Rome, all the military power of Rome, while the seed of the woman is actually bound in chains, weak and vulnerable. And Pilate, he begins to investigate Jesus on three things. Firstly, Jesus' indiscretions. Verse 29 of chapter 18, it says, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" This was the question that would formally open Roman proceedings. What accusations do you bring against this man? And the Jews are so arrogant that they actually expect Pilate to just trust them that he's evil. Don't worry about what accusations we bring about. We wouldn't have brought him to you if he wasn't evil. Trust us, he's evil. Well, that doesn't cut it for Pilate, and so he questions Jesus on the real thing that makes them really angry, and that's his identity. Verse 33, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And then verse 37, "So you are a king." And this is the thing that most angered the religious leaders, that Jesus was claiming to be God and king. This is the theme of the Gospels, the revelation that Jesus is God and the opposition that comes as a result of this. But this also does have some relevance for Rome. You see, Pilate needed to check something off his list. You kind of get the idea that Pilate doesn't really care that much. But he needs to check one thing off his list, and that is Jesus' intentions. Pilate has an obligation to find out if this man is a threat at all to the Roman Empire. There was always uprisers, there was always people trying to, start up insurrection, and so they're trying to find out if Jesus is a political threat. And only then would Pilate really have any interest in his fate. But on all three accounts, Pilate can find nothing to pin on him. And here's what I want you to see in this text. Here's what I want you to see. Three extremely important statements in this text. The first one is found in verse 36. "My kingdom," Jesus says, "is not of this world. If my kingdom was of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I may not be delivered to the Jews." Verse 37, Jesus says his intentions. "I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." That's the second statement. And the third one is this in 19 verse 10. Pilate says this, "Do you know I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered him this, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above." You see, Jesus, he is the embodiment of authority and truth. And he is standing in these Roman headquarters, and his very holy presence there reveals to us that he has actually flipped this trial on its head. No longer is it Jesus who is bound up in chains on trial. It is Pilate and the people who are bound up in their ignorance of the truth. Jesus here has become the chief prosecutor. He's the one who has the truth, and he's the one who is going to defend the truth. You see, Jesus walks into these headquarters as the one who is on trial before the world. But all this goes to expose that actually the world was on trial before him. The world was on trial before Jesus. He is the embodiment of truth, and truth exposes things, doesn't it? Truth sheds light into darkness. And this is actually what happens. The world is on trial before Jesus. And this is the first thing that it exposes. The world's contradictions. Contradiction 1. At the very start in verse 28 that we read out, they led Jesus into Pilate's headquarters, but notice that they wouldn't go in to the headquarters. And that's why you have this farcical scene as you read this, that Pilate has to go inside, talk to Jesus, then he has to go outside and ask them. Then he has to go inside and ask Jesus, then it's farcical. And the reason is because they didn't want to be defiled. Because there was a Jewish rule that if you went into a Jewish household, that you would be ceremonially unclean. And so because the Passover was approaching, they wouldn't have time to get ceremonially clean so that they could actually observe the Passover. And this whole thing exposes a contradiction in them. And John wants us to see this. It's dripping with irony. He wants us to see how ridiculous it is that they are concerned about their ceremonial cleanliness and yet they're about to kill the Son of God. They're about to break their own laws by leading Jesus into these illegal trials. That's the first contradiction. The second contradiction is that Pilate said, "Take him yourselves." And they say, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." You see, the Jews had lost their ability to inflict capital punishment. They were under Roman rule, and so they had to get permission from the Romans to kill Jesus. But all of a sudden, the Jews have this kind of very, false regard for the law. And yet they've broken all their laws in the way that they've brought Jesus to them. Contradiction 3, they choose Barabbas over Jesus. He was a robber and he was a murderer and he was actually in prison for being an insurrectionist, for being someone who was uprising against Rome, the very thing that Pilate has cleared Jesus of. Contradiction 4 is in 19 verse 12. Pilate sought to release Jesus. And they cried, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friends." You see what they're doing? They're blackmailing him. You see, this is the background to this story, is that Pilate was actually a bit of a goofball. He'd actually stuffed up a number of times. And the Jews knew this. And there was a little bit of chatter going on in Rome with Caesar and his leaders that Pilate wasn't up to it. You see, one of his responsibilities was to keep the Jews quiet, keep them under control. Don't let them uproar. Don't let there be, all this uprising going on in a city. Control it. And so what they have actually done is they have appealed to that. They have blackmailed him. They've said, "You know what? If you don't give us Jesus, if you don't hand Jesus over, Caesar's going to find out about this. And you're going to lose your livelihood, or perhaps worse." Contradiction 5, they defiantly say back to him, "We have no king but Caesar." They resented Caesar. They didn't like living under Roman rule, but just so they could get their own way, because they're blind in their hatred, they're willing to say, "We have no king but Caesar," just to get the blood that they wanted. You see, the world was on trial before Jesus, and it exposed the utter contradictions of our human nature, right? We are contradictory beings. I was reading this week, there's a professor named David Berliner. He is a professor of anthropology studies, and he studies the contradictory nature of humanity. He's not a Christian, but he recognizes this. He recognizes that we're contradictory beings. And this is a quote from him. He says, "We can be buying technological devices while opposing child labor and ecological waste. We can be condemning theft and then illegally downloading music and movies. We can hold the value of the right to privacy and a moment later be posting personal photos to Facebook. There are environmentalists who constantly fly in airplanes, finance traders who care about poverty, and sermonizing priests who have lost their faith." He says, Sebastian Mariquin remembers his father singing lullabies while he drifted off to sleep, and yet his father was the drug lord Pablo Escobar, the greatest killer in Colombian history. The human nature in the presence of Jesus has been exposed for its contradictions. We are contradictory beings. Secondly, it's exposed for its cowardice. In the other Gospels, in Matthew, we find out that Pilate's wife has a dream, and she sends a note to Pilate saying this: "Have nothing to do with this innocent man, because in a dream last night I suffered much on account of him." This should have put the fear of God into Pilate, and it did in some sense make him fear, but not enough. Not enough to have a real fear of God before he had a fear of man. In 19 verse 7, we see that he's referred to by the Jews, Jesus is referred to as a son of God, and it strikes some fear in Pilate because he's superstitious. And he thinks, if this man has some sort of divine qualities like, their belief in the Roman gods, in the Greek gods, then maybe he's going to put a curse on me. And so he has this kind of self-interested fear. But then the ultimate act is that he fears the crowd so much as I said before, he fears Caesar and his livelihood so much that in the end, he washes his hands. This is what the world will do to you. The world washes its hands. He washes its hands and hands Jesus over to the crowd. And the point is this, that we live in a world of cowardice. We live in a world that fears man and has no fear of God. We, even as Christians, are like this. That we fear so much what other people might think of us that it causes us at times to forsake God himself. The only thing that causes us to live holy and to live the way that God wants us to live is to actually let our fear of God be greater than our fear of man. Fear of man will rob you of much. It will make your contradictions bloom. But a fear of God would cause us to live each day in reverence of our Creator. You see, it's interesting. This article that I read about from this professor, he talks about how what we should do with our contradictions is that we should learn to embrace them. And the reason that we should learn to embrace them is because on his study of it, it's found to actually produce and inspire creativity in us. And so he says that all the developments and the discoveries in science and art and philosophy and all these things actually come from our contradictory nature, that inside us we have two kind of things going on, and what happens is the disequilibrium that's caused within us causes this kind of expression out of us of creativity and discovery and research and all these types of things. You know what I'm saying? That sort of kind of tension within you that produces and inspires creativity. I sort of know what he means. But how contradictory and how corrupt have we become that we even attribute human creativity to our corruptions, to our contradictory nature, and rather than to our Creator, the one who actually made us in the image of God, who is standing there on trial before us, the Creator of the world, who is the true inspirer of creativity, who is the one, who is the chief artist and the chief scientist and the chief philosopher of the world. And yet we attribute even the things that we see, the beautiful things in us, to our corruptions. How sick, how depraved, how contradictory the human nature actually is. And I would argue this, that any potential that our contradictions has to inspire creativity, it equally has to inspire cruelty. That's what we see next. The world is exposed for its cruelty. A flogging that Jesus gets from verse 19. That's chapter 19, 1-2. Jesus was stripped, he was tied to a post, he was beaten by several soldiers, and the reason for that is because they whipped him for so long and so hard that they actually had to exchange because the soldiers would be exhausted from the Roman practice of scourging. And the soldiers, they would hold these short wooden handles which had leather straps on them, and on the leather straps was pieces of bone and metal. And they would whip Jesus, they whipped him till he was a shell of a man. And often what would happen would there would be veins and muscles and bones that were actually exposed because it was so severe. In fact, most people didn't actually survive the flogging. See, Jesus is the embodiment of truth. He exposed the world's cruelty. You just think, even this week, as we look at the atrocity that's happened in Syria, you see those images of those kids who've been exposed to this sarin gas, and it makes their nerves go haywire and makes their body shut down. And 20 children died, and 80 adults died because of the cruelty of humanity. This is what Jesus exposed. This is what the embodiment of truth exposes in our world. We're contradictory, we're cowards, we're cruel. And Jesus was put on trial, but nothing could be found on him. And we are exposed. And these three things lead up to verse 16, where it says that he is delivered to be crucified. The kingdom of the serpent appears to be on the march to victory. The final death blow of the seed of the woman, and yet there is a beautiful irony in the crucifixion which reveals which kingdom is actually in control and which kingdom will actually prevail. You see, most people actually think that the problem that God had to overcome in all this was that the kingdom of the seed of the serpent crucified Jesus, and so God had to step in and resurrect him. That's how most often we think about this. Nothing could be further from the truth. And John is telling us exactly like that. Unlike the other gospel writers, John wants to show us who has always been in control, even from before Genesis 3:15 and the announcement of the rival kingdoms, and all throughout the Old Testament where the promise of the seed was under threat. John wants to show us something who is always the one who has always been in control. In John, when the Jewish authorities came to arrest Jesus, Jesus stepped forward and went out to meet them. When Peter strikes with the sword, John says, "Put your sword away, Peter." In John, when Jesus claims that there's no need to question him because he taught publicly, he taught openly, a guard strikes and rebukes him, but Jesus is not intimidated in John at all. The trial starts with Pilate investigating Jesus, but it ends with Jesus investigating Pilate. In this powerful statement, Jesus says, "You have no power other than that which has been given to you." In the other Gospels, Simon of Cyrene is the one who comes in immediately to carry the cross of Jesus. But in John wants to tell us that, you know what? Jesus also carried it on his own up the hill. And the most striking of all is that that shows us that Jesus has always been in control, is that on the cross in the book of John, Jesus says the words, "It is finished." What does that mean? I am the one who says when it's finished. I am the one who has been in control of this from the beginning, from the creation of the world. Jesus has not been defeated. Rather, he's choreographed his own suffering according to God's victorious plan. He has not been defeated in a way which God must overcome with a resurrection. He has come as the greatest contradiction to reverse all other contradictions. This is the greatest contradiction at all. That actually God would become a man. That he would enter the world of contradictions, of cowardice and cruelty. That he would stand there as the embodiment of truth, strength and love. And even though the world is on trial as he stands there, he is actually taken the world's place on trial. This is the sacrificial nature of Jesus. Even though the world is on trial around him, he has actually come and he's taken the place of on trial that we should be on trial. And on Sunday, he rises again. That's how his kingdom proves to prevail. Think about this, the sheer innocence, the sheer perfection of Jesus, the goodness, his completeness over evil stood so much powerfully over evil that Jesus rose. There's so much power in his purity that he rose above it and he defeated evil in the resurrection, and his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. This is the big story of the Bible, that the kingdom of the seed of the woman overcomes the kingdom of the seed of the serpent. And all who acknowledge him, all who acknowledge Jesus will escape the judgment, who will not face the judgment. And this is where it comes into connection with our story, each of our stories. See, there is a meta-narrative of the Bible, and it has characters and tragedies and heroes and lessons and all those things. But the real lesson is how it actually connects in with our story. This is the story, this is the good news that we have this Easter with your friends as you go out this week. And as we lead into Good Friday, is that we have this story, how it's come and invaded our own life. And this story has life and death implications for every person. Every person. And we can respond to it in different ways. We can be like Pilate, and many people are. We can be indifferent. Maybe some of you are heading into Easter this week and you're actually indifferent to it. You're wondering how it's actually going to impact you, and you might actually land on Good Friday and be sitting in the service and actually be like, yep, I understand that Jesus has forgiven my sin, and but you're indifferent to it. And perhaps that indifference works out like this. I'm okay with Jesus as long as he doesn't threaten my empire, as long as he doesn't sort of come and invade my life too much. Yeah, that's sort of Pilate's attitude. These Jews are crazy. I don't really care about these Jews. Do what you want with it. As long as he's not threatening Rome, he's okay. Like, don't worry about it. Maybe that's how some of you are responding to Jesus this Easter, indifference. And then, of course, we could be like the religious leaders, arrogant. That there is a pride that has overtaken your life and has been in your life, a bitterness, an opposition to God, standing on your own 2 feet, not allowing him to come in, challenging God, expecting him to do what you want him to do. And if he doesn't, away with him. Indifference and arrogance. But how should we come? What should our response be? Well, think on this. I started with this silly little story about John and Sue. But just think about this. What must it be like for Sue every year to receive those flowers, even in John's death? Just imagine that. When she opens up the card and she reads those 5 words, "My love for you is eternal." Would she take the flowers and throw them out? Or would she put them to the side? Would she leave the card unopened? Would she neglect to water them and keep them alive in her house so that the aroma of the flowers might fill her house? Would she think to herself in her pride, how lame? That's pathetic. I don't need this in my life. I don't think so. I think she would sit down in her chair, she would look at the gift on her kitchen table, and she'd reflect on the past, she'd remember their glory. She would perhaps shed a tear. She would be thankful for the past, and she'd be overjoyed by the future where all her future gifts have been prepaid for her. With a constant reminder, my love for you is eternal. Wouldn't you feel a sense of grief? And yet at the same time, it would make you want to live every last minute of your life in his honor. I wonder if that's your heartbeat for this Good Friday. This week, take a deep look at the cross. Take a deep look at the gift. Let the aroma of it fill up your heart. See the big story leading up to the trial, and whatever you're facing, remember that God has always been in control, and he is in control, and he will be in control, and his kingdom has overcome. Some of you see the trial of Jesus, see that God is innocent, see that he suffered in your place. And then finally, see that you were on trial, but because he's taken your place, you are free. You can be called a child of God. Let's pray.